Redistributing income takes property from one person to give it to another. A minimum wage law prevents an employer from using his property, the business, in the most profitable manner. Outlawing prostitution prevents women from selling the use of their property, their bodies, in whatever manner they choose. Excellent quote from this terrific book, Libertarianism A to Z, with Jeffrey Miron. Jeff Miron is the senior lecturer and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University, as well as the director of economic studies at the Cato Institute. Mr. Miron, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So what is libertarianism and why are you a libertarian?
Libertarianism is roughly the idea that the right amount of government policy is very, very little, that government is there only to restrain a few bad things that cannot be accomplished, to promote a few things that cannot be readily accomplished by private arrangements, free markets, and so on. The few things that libertarians would endorse would be national defense and criminal justice enforcement, contract enforcement, but almost nothing else. And I'm a libertarian because my training in economics has convinced me that when governments try to make things better, they frequently make them worse. And so while markets are not perfect, left to their own devices, private arrangements are sometimes imperfect on their own, attempts to make them better that come from government, they typically make things worse rather than better.
What is capitalism and why is it morally superior to socialism?
So capitalism is a somewhat unfortunate term because it implies that it has something to do with capital. And in fact, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with capital at all. I think the term that's a little bit more accurate or suggestive is simply free markets. But either way, the idea is that there should be few, if any, rules, regulations, taxes, et cetera, imposed by government on the operation of markets, that they should be left to operate on their own, and that individuals and businesses will make decisions that are in their own interest, and that will overall lead to an efficient economy that produces the most it can from the inputs that it uses. In terms of the morality, I tend not to think of it in terms of morality. I come to all these questions from an economics perspective, and I find that the term morality is rarely illuminating because people with very different views on what policy should be often both claim that their view is the moral view, and that doesn't lead to anything. I mean, people who support the death penalty for certain crimes might say it's immoral not to take the life of someone who's committed a heinous act. But people who oppose the death penalty will say it's immoral for the state to take a life. Those two views, which seemingly based on claims about morality, are opposite. And there's no obvious way to reconcile them by just talking about moral claims. Instead, I would think about most issues, including that one, such as the death penalty, in terms of the consequences. What are the consequences of imposing the death penalty for certain crimes? And personally, I would point to a number of undesirable consequences from using the death penalty that made me think that possibly, with a very small number of exceptions, it's not advisable to use the death penalty as one method of trying to punish or deter crime.
Okay. So let's say I am a leftist who only cares about the poor. If I only really care about helping the poor, why should I consider capitalism or libertarianism as as the most beneficial ideal?
I would hope that leftists, that people who are very focused on helping the least fortunate in society, would be open to free markets, to capitalism, to libertarianism, based on the empirical claim and the evidence that capitalism is best for the poor. It's better for the poor than socialism or redistribution and things like that. Why? First of all, and I think even most socialists or liberals or lefties would agree with this, free markets lead to the biggest overall economic pie. So at a minimum, we have more available to be shared by, to be consumed by all of the relevant participants, all the relevant stakeholders. But second, almost all of the deviations from free markets tend to disadvantage some people relative to others. And whom do they disadvantage? They mainly disadvantage people who are poor. Now, the one possible exception that liberals would point to is redistributive taxation, in particular, things like a social safety net, a minimum guarantee of income, or health insurance for the poor, or funding of education for means-tested vouchers for education and things like that. And there, I think that libertarians have to be a little bit careful. If we were talking about a social safety net that guaranteed $1 of income per year to every member of society, is that by itself going to do great harm, shrink the economic pie, et cetera? No, it's probably not. If we guaranteed $1,000 per person, if we had a universal basic income that was fairly modest, okay, would that help some people who might not get helped by private charity? That's possible. Certainly, can't rule that out. But if we had a minimum guaranteed income of $10,000 or $100,000 a year, yes, that would help those people who are unfortunate, but it would also incentivize a lot of people to work less hard and to live off of this guaranteed income if it were substantial. So if we're going to talk about whether to have a social safety net, we should also be talking about how generous it is. A very stingy, modest social safety net, I think reasonable people can disagree about. I personally am not sure I would ever endorse such a policy, but I understand why reasonable people would. I think libertarians have some understanding of why we might want to help people who are not fortunate, who have had bad luck. Libertarians tend to believe that private charity will address that in a good way, but there's no guarantee private charity will help everyone who's deserving. So perhaps there's some small role for government there. But that, I think, is the maximum that libertarians would accept.
So what examples in the real world would you use regarding maybe countries or states or time periods that capitalism has worked as opposed to socialism or fascism or communism?
Well, roughly, if we look at most of the past 200, 250 years, the period since the Industrial Revolution, the countries that are currently the richest countries, the United States, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, to some degree, varying degrees, Japan, some countries in Latin America, the ones that have gotten richer are the ones that have had free markets, have had capitalism. And the ones that have stagnated have been the ones that had socialism, communism, various perturbations around those, such as communist China, Cuba, North Korea, former Soviet Union, and so on. So I think looking both across countries in recent years or looking over the past several hundred years, once countries started adopting free market capitalism, those countries that adopted it have grown quite well. Those countries that did not have, on the whole, grown much less successfully than the free market countries.
I remember someone once telling me the practice case of taking Germany, splitting it into two, you had East Germany versus West Germany. That alone actually convinced them of free markets, because that's as close as you're going to get in the social sciences to a controlled experiment. Maybe North and South Korea is right. a close second.
Right.
How
reverse? At some point, we went back from having a split Germany to having a unified Germany, where East Germany came back into having a free market system, with some regulation and intervention, but overall a free market system. And indeed, it has grown and has caught up in large part to the western part of Germany. So both when we went toward the socialism for East Germany, it got worse, and when we reversed it, it got better again.
Thomas Sowell always said the fraudulence of, many of the leftists can be seen in the fact that they're always talking about redistributing wealth, when they never talk about how wealth is created in the first place. You got to make it before you redistribute it. I'm curious, as an economist, how is wealth created?
We create wealth by saving and investing in productive activities. That includes machines, factories, and so on. It also includes research in ideas, research and development to have new innovations and different ways of, better ways of producing things, newer products that are more effective than the products that came before, cars instead of the horse and buggy, and cell phones instead of dial, standard old phones, and so on and so forth. So people have to first forego some current consumption. They have to save. They have to use those savings to invest in productive activity, including ideas. And that investment then leads to more output per unit of inputs and the accumulation of wealth.
I once had an econ major in college tell me that North Korea was wealthier than America because the citizens there are more equal and wealth is determined by equality. I'm curious, how can we actually measure wealth? If it's not just in dollar amounts, you can have $100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, but that doesn't mean anything. How is wealth accurately measured from the economic perspective?
Well, we do try to measure it in things like some currency, like dollars. You could think about measuring it in physical units, which would get you some reasonable ideas, number of cars per capita, number of houses per capita, and things like that. You're going to get fairly similar results, okay, whichever of those approaches you employ. The person who said having everybody be equal is having a lot of wealth, at a minimum, is using the term wealth in a very non-standard way. That is not what economists mean when they talk about wealth. The person could absolutely say, I prefer to live in a society with low consumption per person, but where consumption is very, very similar across people. I certainly defend that person's ability to have that view, right to have that view. I don't share that view, but they're using the term wealth in a bizarre and unconventional way at a minimum.
So economics is one of these terms that gets thrown around so often. I'm wondering, can you define economics?
Well, the classic definition of economics is that it's the study of the allocation of scarce resources. Economics you can think of as one fact and one assertion or assumption. The fact is that 2 + 2 is 4. It's not 5 or 7 or whatever a politician wants it to be. At any moment in time, there's a finite amount of resources. There's a finite number of hours in the day. You can't just get more stuff just by wishing it or passing a law about it or anything like that. So we have to study whether to allocate our time and our income from a given period to consumption versus savings and so on and so forth. The assumption that economists make, which is not essential to everything economists have to say that's useful, but it is certainly adds something to the fact that resources are scarce. The assumption is that people have goals, not just people, organizations, governments, politicians, that all the actors in society have goals, and they try to achieve those goals in some purposeful way. So in the simple examples, firms try to maximize their profits. Individuals might try to have a higher income or to have a high combination of income and leisure. Okay. Nonprofit organizations, okay, have other goals, such as, okay, trying to educate a lot of people or trying to raise a lot of money to redistribute for research on a particular disease. Politicians have goals. Their goals are to get reelected, amongst other things. But that's economics in a nutshell. Resources are scarce, and people have goals that they try to achieve. And those have strong implications. The implication is that if you pass policies that interfere in the set of incentives that people have, okay, then you're going to change the outcomes, and you may incentivize people to do things that are undesirable, not just the things that you're trying to incentivize them to do.
Yeah, excellent. That was an excellent answer. I'm curious. So when the average person hears economics, they go, all right, the Dow Jones, unemployment rate, and just a lot, I have a job, it doesn't really affect me. Why should the average person care about economics?
I think a typical person should care about economics because it provides an organizing framework that allows you to think about your decisions in ways that will allow you to have better decisions from whatever perspective you think is better. If we're talking about an individual, and you recognize that decisions today have effects on the amount of resources you have in the future, how much you consume now, and how you store any wealth anything that you're not consuming now, it will affect how much you have to spend in retirement, whether you have a luxurious retirement or a relatively stingy retirement. It doesn't tell you that being a high saver versus a high spender in your youth is good or bad, but it does encourage you to recognize that the decisions you make now have implications for the situation you'll find yourself in later. And I think that's true very broadly. By thinking about these resource constraints and by thinking about the incentives of different policies and different decisions, it allows you to accomplish whatever goals you might have in a more effective way.
It's incredible to see the amount of products and services that have increased rapidly in quality and lowered in their price over time. However, it seems like the healthcare industry is a bit of a unique example, or maybe I'm just propagandized and I don't have the correct stats on that. Regarding America, what would you say are the best ways we can use free markets to solve rising healthcare costs?
So first, I would say that the fact you described, many products have come down dramatically in price at the same time that their quality has improved dramatically over decades. That's certainly right. The laptop computer that you and I are both using would be a classic example. Other technology, things like cell phones, et cetera, okay, classic example. I would say that healthcare's price increases are often overstated in the sense that the quality of the healthcare that's available has indeed gone up in many instances. So when you go to the doctor for many diseases, they can engage in diagnostic techniques, in surgeries, and provide medications and so on that may be expensive, but that are far more effective in whatever was available 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And for example, a standard example that people use is if you needed cataract surgery, say 50 years ago, okay, first thing is they would only do one eye at a time because there was some non-trivial chance that cataract surgery might cause you to end up being blind rather than being able to see better. And they didn't want to accidentally blind you in both eyes. You might have spent 7, 8, 10 days in the hospital to recover from the cataract surgery. And the success rate of the surgery was far less than 100%. Nowadays, cataract surgery might cost a similar or a greater amount, but many people do both eyes on the same day. The recovery is mild discomfort at home for half a day or a day, and the success rate is much, much higher. So even if the price has gone up, okay, the quality has also gone up tremendously for many things. Now that said, yes, we're absolutely spending more and more and more of GDP on healthcare. I think the basic point is we're subsidizing GDP and we're not subsidizing laptop computers, at least not to anything like the same degree. You subsidize something, you tend to raise its price. People buy more of it, but you shift out the supply curve. You're trying to produce more and more, and that means the costs tend to be higher and higher. And via the taxpayer treatment of employer-paid health insurance premium, via Medicaid, via Medicare, Obamacare, a very large fraction of the country has its health care substantially subsidized. That's, of course, going to raise prices. And so the single best thing is to roll that back, is to reduce the amount due to which subsidies exist in healthcare, okay? And that should lead to moderation in the rate of increase of prices.
I want to give you the best argument I've heard ever for keeping drugs illegal. So this is an argument by Jonah Goldberg, who says, using drugs alters the mind, thus does not allow you to use reason and engage in free will in freedom. Therefore, freedom to use drugs is actually a contradiction because once you use them, you then become enslaved. So it's actually not infringing upon your freedom to stop someone from enslaving themselves and possibly negatively affecting others, whether they're on crack or cocaine or meth. How would you address that argument as someone who's focused on drug legalization?
First of all, the idea that it changes you in a way that takes away your free will, that's an assertion. I don't see how that's a scientific fact in any way, shape, or form. Second, to the degree that while you're under the influence or after you've become accustomed to using drugs, your attitude, your free will, if you want to call it that, is different. Okay? Even if that's true, it's also true of consuming alcohol. It's true of consuming chocolate ice cream. It's true of going to a soul revival at a Baptist convention. It's true of engaging in exercise. It could be true of billions of things. Who gets to decide when my free will has been compromised by some activity that I have engaged in? Okay, I think that Goldberg's view is absolutely a path to totalitarianism, toward a few people who run the government deciding which things are bad for me and which things are not, okay, and just dictating everything that I could possibly consume. I don't see how anyone who believes in freedom could possibly endorse that view, with apologies to Jonah.
Sure. What often a criticism of capitalism and free markets is a rather odd one. It gets criticized for engaging in child labor, even though child labor has existed since Adam and Eve, let's say. What would you say to someone who says an interventionist government, an interventionist economic policy from the state is justified because we need to stop things like child labor?
So first, the fact that we might intervene to help people who are not yet sufficiently old, mature, experienced, etc., to make good decisions for themselves, that's something that, at least at a broad level, libertarians, would sort of accept. Minimum purchase ages of some amount for alcohol, restrictions on who can buy cigarettes and things like that. Libertarians, I think, have their reservations about even those policies, but they'll accept that maybe we make distinctions between children and adults. That said, okay, we have people who are likely to act in the best interest of children with respect to child labor, that is, their parents. Not every parent. Of course, some parents make bad decisions for their kids. But if you're going to let it be legal to have kids, okay, you might as well let parents have a broad range in deciding things for their kids, because the decision to have a kid is probably the single biggest negative thing you might do that would adversely affect children. With respect to child labor in particular, it's one thing to sort of live in a rich country where children are mainly supported, they can go to decent quality schools, and so on and so forth, and say, oh, we don't want sort of 8-year-olds working in sweatshops because they're better off going to elementary school and learning reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's completely different if you live in a very, very poor country where there aren't schools available, may not be schools available, or not high quality schools, where the level of family income is much lower and the extra income that a 12 or 14-year-old could bring in might make a substantial difference to the overall well-being of that family. We should remember that in many cases, families are not sending all their kids off to sweatshops. They may be taking turns. They may be having kids work for a year or two in order to finance the education of other children in their family. So the net effect of child welfare and child labor, in those countries, okay, could easily be beneficial on average. And the evidence suggests that. The evidence suggests that child labor, while not ideal, obviously, in the sense that we would prefer those societies be rich enough that they didn't need to send their kids off to work, but it's still better than the alternative of having government tell them they can't engage in child labor. And every country that has gradually gotten richer, child labor has gone away on its own, because it became then the trade-off between getting an education and being child labor has gradually tilted toward education. And so it's a problem that gradually takes care of itself. So it's not a question of whether child labor is good or bad. It's whether a policy that outlaws it is good or bad, and outlawing it clearly is not in the interest, okay, of children in the vast majority of instances, or the data that I've seen.
Another criticism of capitalism and free markets is that there is a natural tendency for those in powerful positions to end up monopolizing industry, buying out their competitors, having a monopoly on a product or a service, and then having the public really under its thumb. Maybe they could charge any price they want. They could shorten the supply, increase the supply. Why do you think capitalism is a legitimate system, and as far as dealing with monopolies?
I think capitalism is better is the right system for several reasons. First, when companies are making profits, when they're able to charge significantly in excess of their cost, that creates an incentive for someone else to enter that industry and make the same product. And we just have, humongous evidence that competition, okay, is vibrant when the government doesn't interfere with it. New companies come in and make competing products. Second, a huge amount of the barriers to entry that prevent companies coming in and from competing are created by government. There are regulations which raise the minimum efficient size at which companies can operate. There are trade barriers which prevent companies from other countries from coming in and competing away monopoly profits of domestic industries, and so on and so forth. The set of things that are seriously monopolized, okay, has a huge proportion of government activities. If you want to go to a government-funded school in your town, city or town, where do you go? You go to the local monopoly-supplied government public school, which is where your tax dollars have gone. If you want to have delivery of letters directly to your mailbox in your house, you can't get FedEx to do that. They have to request a signature. You have to use the local post office. So the post office has a monopoly on first-class delivery. And there are billions of examples like that. Government is a much bigger monopolist of a lot more things than the private sector. Now, there are certainly big companies in the world, okay, Google and Facebook and Amazon and all those sorts of things. Okay, they have competitors, and the set of companies that we think of as the big companies now bears almost no overlap with the set that we thought of 20 years ago. Okay, if you had said, what's the famous search engine that's going to take over the world 20, 30 years ago, you would have said Yahoo. But it's not Yahoo right now. At the moment, it's Google. But it's probably not going to be Google 10 or 20 years from now. Who first was thought to be the monopolist for laptop computers? Okay, IBM. Who owns an IBM computer anymore? Basically, at least the laptops, almost no one. So despite the fact that some companies become very big, that's exactly what creates the seeds of entry and competition to compete away those profits.
Yeah, it's incredible to see, like, the Rockefeller criticism is very easy to jump towards. But when you look at the data, it was actually Rockefeller lowering the price of oil, getting us off whale oil, and increasing access to more and more people as the years went on. So people just look at that and go, he's too big, break him up. It's like, do you not see the net benefit that there's a reason people keep voluntarily giving money in exchange for that service? Right. I remember Milton Friedman's great line. Someone goes, we got to have government make, ceilings on the percentage of industries these companies can control. And he goes, yeah, the best way to do that is to embrace totally free trade and free competition, so that they have more competitors and consumers have more choices. Right. And the kid was he's like, I'm an econ major and I've never heard that. Wow. So how is it that when you watch the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas, he's this rich guy who holds up a brick to his ear to talk into? It's like one of those cell phones. And today, the average person has a much more efficient cell phone that does a ton more things and is probably at a lower price. How is it that products over time increase in quality and lower their production costs?
In a nutshell, because of innovation, because of technological progress, because by accident or by deliberate research and development, people figure out better ways to do things that allow them to get more with less, to economize on the use of labor and capital and other inputs, and do a better job of making something that is desirable. So we've seen innumerable examples of that for centuries, and it seems to go along at a sort of more or less sort of consistent pace, although clearly ups and downs. There's some periods that seem to see a lot more technological innovation than others, but it's just people having better ideas. Now, there are economists who study exactly how we can incentivize that and what affects it, and particularly whether government should be involved in helping to promote production of ideas. Okay? I don't think the evidence suggests that government has played a good role or a beneficial role in promoting innovation. It's moved along on its own with or without a government intervention.
Does capitalism result in recessions or depressions or panics?
Free markets, free market economies unquestionably go up and down. Do they? And standard would be to call those booms and recessions. Are those due to capitalism per se, or are they due to exogenous shocks like super bad weather, floods, droughts, hurricanes? Are they due to events like wars? There's not a great answer out there. Are they due to monetary policy where central banks have decided inflation was getting a little too high, and so they raise interest rates to try to slow down the economy and inadvertently create a recession, or not entirely inadvertently? To some extent, that's the goal, is to create a recession to slow down inflation. All those things undoubtedly play a role. If you look at the history of output in the US and a lot of other rich countries over a long period, what you're struck by is not the booms and recessions. What you're struck by is the overall long-term growth. Over decades and century and a half, maybe two, for which we have data, we just see this consistent upward movement. Okay? And so it's not clear we should worry nearly so much about the booms and recessions, because they're pretty small relative to anything that will have any impact on the long-run growth rate of the economy.
Is being pro-capitalism the equivalent of being pro-business?
Absolutely not. Okay? The goal of capitalism, of free markets, is to help consumers, okay, not to help businesses. Okay? And businesses don't really like that. Competition is not particularly good for the competitors. Okay? They have to compete. They end up, as a result of competition, with lower profits, with prices that are pretty close to their cost. So they're not making much money on each good that they sell. Okay? But it's good for the consumers. And so that's one reason I tend not to call it capitalism. I think it's calling it free markets, okay, shifts the attention away from who the beneficiaries really are. The purpose of free markets is to help consumers. Okay? And in the ideal setting, okay, the people who are in business and making income, making profits from selling products, are almost indifferent between doing it or not doing it, because the rate of return they're getting from their effort is not much better than they would get by going off and doing something else. Okay? They're just getting enough to keep them incentivized to stay producing those products, because competition drives down any profits in excess of that minimum necessary to keep people involved.
A major criticism that is coming into the mainstream with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is that in an unregulated market, as if that's what we have, in an unregulated capitalist system, some get more than others, and then it sort of spirals out of control, creating systemic inequality. Therefore, the state is justified in coercively stepping in to make things a little more equal. How would you respond to the claim that capitalism creates inequality, therefore is illegitimate?
So I think there's no question that inequality will exist in a free market system. Okay? Libertarians shouldn't deny that for a second. If you are the smart person like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or whoever who comes up with a really good idea, if you're super talented at playing football or singing songs or anything else, you're going to earn a lot more than people who have less talent. That's absolutely part of a free market. However, okay, I don't think that's what Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or anyone is concerned about. Okay, they're not upset that Beyonce makes a very high income or Tiger Woods makes a very high income. They're concerned about crony capitalism, about people who get very rich, okay, in ways that don't seem deserving, that don't seem to be based on their economic productivity. So I think the point libertarians need to emphasize is that most of those inappropriate differences in income come from government, not from the private sector. They come from government in many ways. So barriers to entry in particular professions, Means that some people get to be doctors and sell their services at very high prices, and other people are kept out of that business, okay, and earn lower incomes. It also means that people who want to purchase services from lawyers, doctors, plumbers, hair braiders, all these industries that are regulated, where barriers to entry in professional activities, that people pay higher prices for those things than they would. And of course, that particularly hurts people who are lower income. Restrictions on property ownership and development adversely affect people who don't already happen to own those properties. There's zillions of examples of regressive regulation, okay, all sorts of interferences which create inappropriate winners and losers in the economy. And that's the main source of unwarranted inequalities in income, as opposed to just differences in income.
A Marxist critique of free markets could be that a system of total profit seeking sort of exploits the worker, putting them at the mercy of the boss, sort of controlling them, dominating them, and not allowing the working class to live a fulfilling life. Is this a problem with free markets? And does it justify government intervention, worker exploitation?
So exploitation suggests somehow that the employers are coercing or forcing the employees into something that's inappropriate. Okay? The economics description, my description is some people who don't have particularly high levels of skills, the highest paying jobs that they can get, they involve relatively modest wages. And that's exactly what economics says should happen to have an economically efficient system, people getting paid their marginal products. Okay? And as long as there is reasonable competition for workers across industries, there's not just one McDonald's in your town that can hire a low-skilled worker, but there's a Burger King and a Kentucky Fried Chicken and a Walmart and so on and so forth. All employees are going to end up getting paid roughly their marginal product, that is, how much they contribute to the production of that business. The solution is not regulation. The solution, if to the extent there is one, is for some people to acquire more skills, to get better education or different types of training and things like that. But that's not going to equalize incomes. It's absolutely right that some people with low skills are going to earn low incomes and some people with higher skills are going to earn higher incomes. But I don't think calling that exploitation is accurate or constructive. That's exactly what a free market system is supposed to do. And the people who are earning the low incomes don't like it. But blaming it on the employers, okay, is not accurate. It just doesn't get us anywhere.
Sam Harris was talking to Ben Shapiro, and he said, yeah, you know, free markets are pretty much good, but externalities exist, and where A and B make a deal, and it negatively affects C, by C bearing the cost to something he did not voluntarily agree to. Is the existence of externalities a justification for state intervention in the economy?
Well, there are some externalities that libertarians, free market economists would accept as potentially a justification. So if I own a factory and I'm making widgets at this factory, in the process of making widgets, I dump some kind of toxic waste into a nearby stream or river or lake, and that reduces the quality of the water, and that adversely affects people downstream who want to use that water for drinking or swimming or fishing or whatever, then that's absolutely a standard externality. And the free market, leaving that alone and not doing anything about it, does lead to an inefficiency, because I, the manufacturing owner, don't take into account that I'm not only producing a good thing, the widgets, but a bad thing, the pollution. Okay? And ideally, I would balance those two things and moderate how many widgets I produce so I'm not producing quite so much pollution. So in those cases, ideally, there's a way to assign property rights to the river or the stream so that there's a price at which I'm allowed to pollute, and that price reflects the degree to which I'm damaging that river, and you get a perfectly efficient outcome. It's not always possible to assign property rights to everything that we would like to do that for. Clean air would be a sort of really obvious example. It's kind of hard to say that I have the property right to the cubic meter of air that's right in front of me, and you have a property right to some other cubic meter. So some kinds of regulation that are aimed at reducing these externalities of putting noxious fumes in the air or noxious waste into the water supply, okay, are, I think, consistent with libertarian principles because they're trying to define and enforce property rights and get to an efficient outcome. That said, some of these interventions, okay, just happen to work very badly in practice. We may do them excessively. We may be focused on externalities which are relatively trivial, et cetera. And sometimes people use the term externality to refer to things which are not. If I happen to wake up in the morning and decide I like chocolate ice cream more than vanilla, and so I switch my purchases from vanilla to chocolate, and that raises the price of chocolate relative to vanilla, that's not an externality. That's just the market price reflects the productivity and preferences of all the people involved in the market. So people overuse the term and use it to refer to things that are not part of the legitimate economic paradigm.
It's a little rich getting this from government. It's like, okay, what if politicians pass a law amongst themselves that negatively affect hundreds of millions of other people? Or what if politicians start a war that end the lives of other innocent people? Like affected third parties, really, that's your government intervention excuse of all the groups. You, in this excellent book, Libertarianism A to Z, discuss drug legalization and prostitution as far as people fearing, conservatives mainly, that the legalization would lead to the legitimization of these things and would thus lead to a degenerative society, and one that is not productive, not spiritual, and where people aren't really conscious and coherent. How do you respond to free markets could lead to degeneracy and societal breakdown?
So first, I think the view that we value freedom and we let each individual decide what is in his or her own interest, and that individual gets to decide what is good or bad, whether you want to call that degenerate or whatever. If you believe in freedom, you believe in freedom, and it's the freedom to be degenerate if that's what you want to be. So that's a first answer. Second, there is just no evidence that on a large scale, very many people want to be degenerate. That's different from saying there's no evidence that people want to consume alcohol or drugs or prostitution. Obviously they do, but it's just an attempt at spinning at sort of thought control to label them as degenerate because some people happen not to like them. Okay. Most importantly, the effects of any of those substances or anything else in possibly allowing some people to engage in behavior that the majority doesn't like, it's way worse under prohibition than it is under legalization. If all these activities and substances are legal, then the people who sell them are legitimate business types who pay their taxes, who tend to obey whatever mild regulation might exist, such as a minimum purchase age, who can be pillars of the community because they're earning profits that they're donating to charity, they're employing lots of people, they're just business people. The ones who consume these activities, who purchase them, are not having to buy them on street corners from people who are themselves criminals. They're not being subject to poor quality control, so they accidentally overdose from consuming adulterated versions of these products. Okay? And so almost everything negative that you think about associated in the public mind with these activities is way worse when they're outlawed and people purchase them in the black market than when they can purchase them from standard legal mechanisms as we have for alcohol, tobacco, and all sorts of other activities, many of which at sometimes have been labeled as degenerate as well. But it's just so frustrating because that is people trying to say, this is good, what you're doing, but what I'm doing is okay. But why do they get to decide what's okay for me? Why don't I get to decide what's good for me?
Anyone who reads Bill Crystal telling me that my behavior is degenerative is just so, what a projection level that is. So when Henry Kissinger came to America, his teacher tried to get rid of him by assigning him a bunch of Immanuel Kant to read. And Kissinger ends up reading all the material and writing an essay called The Meaning of History, in which he says, even if totalitarianism leads to a lot of beneficial economics or a lot of wealth. Even if it does, it's still unjustified because freedom is a morally justified end in it of itself. How do you communicate to the average person when advocating policies of freedom? Do you focus on the morality, the principles, the utilitarian outcomes? I'm curious, as a Harvard professor, how you do that.
I focus on the consequences. You could call it costs and benefits, although I mean costs and benefits in a very broad sense of including effects on social norms and slippery slopes and social attitudes and things like that. But I focus on that rather than on any moral claims for a couple of reasons. First, I think if you said to many people, if we have totalitarian government, we'll have 3 times the GDP per capita, they wouldn't care so much about the fact that was not moral. They would be happy to focus on the GDP per capita. But second, I don't think we really have to argue about that because there's not a shred of evidence that totalitarianism does lead to more GDP per capita. All the evidence is that it leads to less GDP per capita. And third, it's basic economics, common sense, that when you start to tell people to do things this way versus that way, when you control people implicitly at the point of a gun, you're going to get less productivity. You're going to get less freedom, less GDP, less of almost anything you can imagine that we value. So the possibility that totalitarianism could actually lead to more economic output, okay, just doesn't make sense. People don't have the incentives to work hard. You don't get innovation. You don't get any of the good things that come out of free markets of people creating lots of wealth because they might get some private benefit out of creating all that wealth by innovation and entrepreneurship and so on.
So looking at the economy, one might say we have producers, sellers, and consumers, and the consumers don't have the time, the energy, the efforts to really research all the products indefinitely before purchasing them. Does the average consumer ignorance justify state intervention in the form of consumer protection, such as the FDA?
I think that the consumer protection does much more harm than good. First of all, you don't have to go out and research every product every time you go to buy it. You do more or less what the guy said, what Noah Wiley said in A Few Good Men, when he's being cross-examined and asked how he figured out where the mess hall was, even though there was no manual that told him where the mess hall was. He said, I just followed everybody else at lunchtime. Okay, so you see that most people are buying their goods and services from Sears or Walmart or CVS or whatever. You follow along and you're going to get sort of a reasonable outcome. Some people pay close attention and comparison shop, and that tends to push bad products out and allow good products to survive. We have simple mechanisms that help people make those decisions with modest costs like Yelp or Consumer Reports or things like that. In addition, the consumer protectionism has a bunch of its own negative consequences. At a broad level, it sends this message that people are too stupid to make reasonable decisions for themselves. And that's unfortunate. It sends a message that the government has taken care of product quality in the market, so you, the consumer, don't need to think about it. But that's a potentially quite unfortunate message, because even if regulation is there, if you don't use your brain, you can easily make all sorts of dumb choices. So we want people to be thinking to a moderate degree, okay, not just trusting that the government is taking care of these problems. In the case of the FDA, pretty suggestive evidence that the FDA kills, even though it probably keeps some bad products off the market. Okay, it also keeps tons of good products, good medicines off the market longer than would be the case in a less regulated market. And so people who can benefit from all those good products, okay, face worse health or even death, okay, waiting for these products to be made available, to be approved by the FDA.
Excellent. I'm curious, who do you think is the most important economist in history?
I think it's very hard not to say Adam Smith. There is so much in The Wealth of Nations that we still think of as essentially right. So I would go with Adam Smith.
Have you read A Theory of Moral Sentiments?
No, I haven't. I'll have to confess. I haven't read it.
What would you say is the most important takeaway from the Wealth of Nations? I know it's a big book. I know that's
it's a very, very long book. I haven't read all of that book either, but I think the most important takeaway is the idea of decentralization. That I forget the exact quote, but it's something like, "It is not from the benevolence of the baker and the butcher, et cetera, that we get good outcomes. It's because they're acting in their own self-interest, trying to make money by selling you stuff, but under competition, okay, they're trying to sell you stuff means they have to make a product that has high value to the consumer relative to the price that the consumer is going to have to pay. That encourages them to minimize cost, that encourages them to make a high quality product, to not to poison their customers. It's because if you poison your customers, you don't have much of a market left." And so that idea that decentralization, individual decision-making leads to a good outcome overall without centralization or government intervention or coordination. I think that's probably the most important idea.
All right. If you could pick one book that isn't Libertarianism A to Z that you would recommend for everyone in the world to read, what would it be?
It would be Capitalism and Freedom, because it's essentially, it's at some level, it's a short version of A Wealth of Nations, but also makes a point which is not front and center of Wealth of Nations, which is the relationship between political freedom and economic freedom. One of the crucial things that Friedman was after in that book was that lots of people say they care about freedom and they think about having democracy, they think about the right to vote, or they think about various civil rights and so on and so forth. But many of them tend to think of those separately from economic freedoms, being able to choose one's occupation, being able to choose whether to get an education and how much, choose what business you enter, where you live, so on and so forth. And Friedman's view is that the freedom to try to accumulate wealth and to become richer, the freedom to make all those economic decisions, buy the products that you want at the prices that you're willing to pay and all that, those are part and parcel of the political freedoms, and you can't have one without the other. I think that's a crucial insight from Capitalism and Freedom. So that would be the one book.
All right. So
I don't know if you've noticed, but there's actually a picture of Adam Smith behind me.
I did. Yeah.
Okay.
So I want to ask you about Chapter 8 of Capitalism and Freedom, titled Capitalism and Discrimination. I'm sorry, Chapter 7. So say I am a minority in a country. This would sort of allow people to discriminate against me, not sell me products, services, deprive me of health care, deprive me of a standard of living, and really take away my dignity as a human being. If I'm afraid of discrimination existing against oppressed groups, why should I advocate capitalism?
So the argument is that capitalism is actually better in the labor market for minorities, because under free markets, as long as some non-discriminating employers exist, they obtain a cost advantage by their willingness to hire people independent of any characteristics such as race or gender. The discriminating employers, the ones who say only want to hire males or only want to hire whites, they face a smaller supply of labor because they're not willing to hire people who are male or African American or whatever. Okay? And so the non-discriminating employers have a cost advantage, and they will drive out the discriminating employers. And when all is said and done, men and women, blacks and whites, Jews, Christians, whatever, will all be paid the same wage, adjusting for, of course, differences in skills, not across every possible, different people who have different training, of course, can still get different wages. But for a given level of skill acquisition, human capital, training, people will get the same wage regardless of their other characteristics. There's plenty of evidence that's suggestive that that mechanism is operative in free market societies.
All right, final question. It seems like a lot of people from their first entrance into public schools, and the media and Hollywood reinforce this, that they spend their entire sort of intellectual thought lives swimming with the tide of, yes, government's necessary, we need state intervention, it's legitimate. So when someone comes to a college campus and says the opposite of this, a lot of times, instead of being met with debate, they're actually met people like, I'm using examples of Steven Crowder, Christina Hoff Sommers, Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, Jordan Peterson. They're not met with intellectual debates, but for the first time, they're hearing a non-statist argument, and they sort of erupt into rioting, violence, loud protesting, pulling fire alarms. I'm wondering why you think that is the response of college students in America when confronted with ideas that are conservative or libertarian.
So I guess I'll say two things. One is that I think it makes a huge difference, just as an empirical observation. This is not good, bad, or indifferent, but empirically, I think libertarians get a much, much better reception than conservatives, because the attitudes on campus, which at least amongst the faculty tend to lean in the liberal direction. I think there's no question about that. I think actually the professors at many universities think that it's a virtue, not a bug, that many faculty are liberal leaning. And of course, as a libertarian in a free market, universities should be free to be as lefty or righty or whatever as they want. That's just what the market is going to generate. But given that there is more left-leaning than right-leaning on many campuses, libertarians get an okay reception because many libertarian positions are quite similar to liberal positions: pro-immigration, freedom of choice with respect to abortion, pro-drug legalization, pro-gay marriage, so on and so forth. Okay, conservatives, okay, I think are the ones who are getting the significant pushback on college campuses. I guess the other thing I would say is that the problem, to the extent there's a policy problem, is government-owned and operated universities. If we had just private colleges and universities, and some of them didn't want to have conservative speakers, some of them didn't want to have liberal speakers, whatever, I wouldn't necessarily want to work at such a university. I'd prefer to work at a university that welcomed a broad range of viewpoints, but I wouldn't want policy to try to do anything about it either. I would want to accept that there is variety and some people want to attend a school which has a particular viewpoint and which excludes other viewpoints. And they should be allowed to do that in a free society, even if it's not a place that I particularly want to send my kids to go to school or a place where I'd want to teach. So,
okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes, it does. And we actually have a minute and a half or 2 minutes left. Okay, this is the final question. I am someone who cares that the Puritan work ethic is sort of pushed on people. The need to work and the inability to really relax and enjoy life. And I blame capitalism for this because it just pushes you to work and create profits and produce and never stop and really enjoy the finer luxuries in life. If I'm someone who cares about leisure time and not just being a means to an end to produce profit for a corporation, why should I consider free markets?
Because free markets have created the wealth that has allowed a huge number of people to have way more leisure time than they would in the absence of the huge accumulation of wealth. I mean, think about retirement as one aspect of leisure time. Okay? When Social Security was adopted in the US in the mid-1930s, the age of eligibility was 65. And there have been slight modifications in that sense, but it was 60 to 65, and the life expectancy was 63. Okay? Which means that Social Security at that point was sort of insurance against living too long. Okay? People were not expecting to have 5 or 10 or 20 years of a relatively well-funded retirement. But now a much larger fraction of people do. That's because we have much more wealth. So wealth allows all sorts of things that people want to exist, okay? Whether it's leisure, whether it's more consumption. Okay, if you don't have capitalism, you're not going to have that wealth. You're not going to have the ability to have that leisure.
Again, this is a book, Libertarianism A to Z, by Jeffrey Miron, works at Cato and Harvard. Mr. Miron, thank you so much for taking the time today to have this discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.